Hello and welcome back, sleepywhatsit here with another miniatures video for you. In today's video, we're going to be doing a little tutorial on how you can paint some retro cool, classic 90s era green bases for your minis. In this video, I'm going to be showing you the same paint scheme done 3 different ways, using different brands of paint to achieve the same basic look so you can see some different ways of getting this. First of all, I'm going to be using coat to arm paints, which are basically the closest equivalent to 90s era Citadel paints that are currently available on the market. My understanding is that they're manufactured by the same company that GW contracted out their paint production in the early 90s, so their paint formulations are going to be pretty close to what you got back in the day, other than there's going to be some minor differences in color from availability, pigments, and processes, and things like that. Obviously, if you have some old school Citadel paints, you'll likely get a better match to some old school armies, but those paints are becoming harder and harder to find every day. The second paint line that I'm going to be demonstrating here is using modern Citadel paints. These paints are going to have some noticeable color and consistency differences from the 90s era paints. So this is more of a demonstrating, like, if you go into a Games Workshop store, what can you do to get the same kind of look for it? They may not match that new army you bought in a garage sale for $50 last weekend, but we'll get something decent out of them. And then the third line of paints I'm going to be demoing is Vallejo Game Color, which is a very common paint line available many places. The Game Color line is a solid line of paints designed for painting game figures, so the colors are bright and poppy and tend to match the Citadel line from like the late 90s to early 2000s. So bright, vibrant colors, but they're not going to be as close as I expect the coat to arms to be, but they should look good. Before diving into the actual process we're going to be doing, let's talk about recipes for this color scheme, since I know someone is going to be ripping their dick off in the comments about how I'm not doing it the exact same way that they were taught back in '92 at their local GW store in Squirrel Chest or some nonsense like that. I've looked at a variety of old school painting books from the late 80s on through to early 2000s and referenced a number of White Dwarf magazines from this period, and there does not appear to be a single official Goblin Green base recipe from GW. The variety of studio artists all provide different instructions on how to paint these bases, and even the same artist, like McAvery, will provide different recipes over time on how to do it. And additionally, if you look at something like the cover of Modeling Warhammer Armies here, which in theory was painted either by the same person or at least by the studio at the same time with the same paints and such, there's multiple different variants of these bases being seen here. Like, you can see that they're different. So there is no one true recipe here. So what I'm going to be showing you here is more of a synthesis of the various instructions I could find in original sources. I guess another way to look at this is what I'm showing you is how I'm planning on basing out my 4th edition Vampire Counts army that I'm starting to work on this year. So let's get into our actual basing. As you'll probably have noticed from the pictures before, the basing style has a distinctive texture to it, so we're going to need to apply that before we get down to actually painting. The core of this is gluing down some sand or other light grit all over the entire top of the base, which will give us it'll give us a rough texture, but it's going to be a pretty uniform texture. I'm going to be using CA glue, aka super glue here, since I find it easier to work with, and since I'm planning on priming these before I actually paint, I don't care if I get that like white dust stuff coming from it. If you're wanting to go old school and get the real early 90s experience, you could use watered down PVA, aka white glue here, to glue everything down, but I've personally never had much experience with that. It just doesn't adhere well for me. For grit, I'm using finely crushed aquarium filler, though cleaned sand or like model railway ballast would work too. So once you have the glue spread over the top of the base that you want texture, you're going to need to apply the grit. Since I don't have a model on this base, I'm just dunking it, like plunking it down. If you have a model already attached to your base, it's probably better to sit the base or everything in a container, pour grit over it so it doesn't get everywhere. After applying the grit, you're going to want to tap the base a few times. This is going to knock off any bits that are sitting on the grit but not actually glued down. And then you'll want to go around the edge and scrape off any excess that got glued to places where you don't want it. Since I'm going to be applying primer over this, as I mentioned before, and I'm using CA glue, I don't need to lock it in with varnish or PVA glue. But if you are using PVA, you should lock it in. So next we're going to do is primer our base white, since we're going for bright 90s colors, no grimdark here, it's going to be vibrant. Once we have our prime done, we can start basing things out and doing our actual painting. I'm going to be showing the 3 versions in parallel here. Coat to Arms will be on the left-hand side of the screen, Modern Citadel will be in the center of the screen, and Vallejo Game Color will be on the right hand. The first step of our painting is going to be basing out the entire base using our mid-tone green, which was going to be our eponymous Goblin Green, basically. So for Coat to Arms, this is going to be Goblin Green. For Modern Citadel, this will be Warboss Green. And for Vallejo Game Color, this will be Goblin Green again. You're going to want to get complete coverage here, so especially for things like the Coat to Arms paint, you probably will need multiple coats to get complete coverage. Next step we're going to be doing is shading or washing using a darker green. This step technically isn't necessary, and some instructions don't include it, but I find it does provide a little bit more depth of color to the base, so we're going to be doing it. The wash we're going to be using here is just basically made out of a matte paint, so you can mix like 1 to 4, 1 to 5 parts paint to water to get something that flows really nice. Like basically water it down enough that it doesn't break apart, but it flows, or use a wash medium. So for Coat to Arms, I'm going to be using Bogey Green. Modern Citadel will be Warpstone Green, and the Vallejo Game Color will be Sick Green. The original Citadel name for Bogey Green was Snot Green. After letting our wash dry, we're going to go and do some highlighting via dry brushing. So the first pass of dry brushing here is going to be a relatively heavy one using our mid-tone green. So for Coat to Arms, that's Goblin Green. For Modern Citadel, that's Warboss Green. And for Vallejo, that is Goblin Green. The second highlight I'm going to be doing is using a mix of our mid-tone and our yellow. I achieved this by basically not cleaning off my dry brush between colors, instead putting a bit of yellow paint on the palette and dabbing the dry brush into that to get something vaguely resembling a 1-to-1 mix of it. And then you're going to go and dry brush using that. For yellows, Coat to Arms was Sun Yellow, Modern Citadel was Flash Gitz Yellow, and Vallejo was Moon Yellow. The Citadel original name is Sunburst Yellow, in case you have the old school paints. And then for the final, doing kind of a light dry brush, I just load up more yellow, and at this point I basically should only have yellow on the brush because I've used up all the green, so it's basically going to be the same yellows that we did before, so Sun Yellow, Flash Gitz Yellow, and Moon Yellow. Though we're doing 3 highlighting passes here, technically, we're doing it via dry brushing, and we're doing it without cleaning off our brush, so it should be actually really quick to do this, and you get kind of a nice, complete thing. Once you've completed all this dry brushing, you're going to want to go and clean up the rim of your base using your mid-tone green so that the sides are the right color. And so here's how my base has turned out. Honestly, I'm a bit surprised by how yellow the greens from Coat to Arms are. I don't think this is wrong, just apparently my brain assumed that pictures from old White Dwarf magazines or the painting guides had yellowed over time, or the overhead lighting, because it would have been incandescent, was more yellow than modern lighting, so I thought the bases basically were actually less yellow than they showed up in pictures, but apparently no, they are. The new Citadel base comes out a bit blue-toned, which didn't surprise me as I was painting, because that paint was noticeably more blue-toned than the Coat to Arms, but apparently modern Games Workshop employees think the same thing I think about old-school paints, that apparently we thought that they were artificially being yellowed. And then the Vallejo Game Color kind of falls between the two. Again, nothing particularly surprising about that. We've seen just kind of over time, apparently Citadel paints, their greens have shifted from yellow to blue a little bit. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this informative. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. If you want to see more content like this about miniatures and how to paint them, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're wanting to support the channel in a more material way, I have an account over on Ko-fi where I can accept that. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.